The cattle stood in the snow like survivors of something. Gideon Marsh counted them the way a man counts the last of anything slowly, with the particular dread of arriving at a number that confirms what he already knows. 18. He counted again. 18 still. The snow kept falling across the valley floor of Silver Creek, Colorado, soft and indifferent, covering the tracks of the animals that were no longer there. In the spring, there had been 60 head. That was 8 months ago, and 8 months felt like a different man's life. He stood at the fence line with one hand resting on a post that leaned at a defeated angle, the wood splitting along its grain from 3 years of weather and neglect. It had needed replacing since last autumn. So had the south wall of the barn. So had the hinge on the equipment shed door, and the mortar between the stones of the root cellar and the window pane in the kitchen that let cold air whisper through its crack on windy nights. The list of what needed doing on this land had grown so long that Gideon had stopped adding to it. He just carried it in his chest now, a weight that sat differently from grief but sat just as permanently. He reached into the breast pocket of his coat. The letter was there. It was always there. He had put it in his pocket the morning it arrived, and he had not been able to bring himself to remove it, as though keeping it close to his body was a form of managing it, containing it, preventing it from becoming fully real. The paper was soft now from handling the folds worn thin. He did not need to open it. He knew every word. Final payment of $800 due. December 25th. Failure to remit will result in immediate foreclosure proceedings. December 25th. Christmas Day. He had always thought of Christmas as the kind of day when impossible things became briefly possible. This year it was the day that would decide whether his father's 30 years of work on this land would simply end. The fence post beside him creaked in the wind. Gideon understood the feeling. He put the letter back against his chest and looked out across the valley. The mountains to the west were white to their shoulders, and the sky above them was the particular gray of a Colorado December that had decided to commit. The creek that gave the town its name ran dark between snow-covered banks, visible from where he stood as a thin line of movement in all that stillness. The water rights attached to that creek were the most valuable thing on the property. His father had understood that and had fought to secure them when he first staked the claim. A man could lose cattle to drought and disease. He could rebuild a herd. But water rights in this territory were the kind of thing that changed hands once and stayed changed. The sound came from the road below the property. Before he saw anything, a stagecoach bell faint and then less faint. The particular sound that Silver Creek produced twice a week when the afternoon route came through from Durango. Gideon's stomach did what it had been doing at unexpected intervals for the past 6 months. Whenever he thought about this day, it tightened. Not from anticipation. From the particular discomfort of a man who has done something he cannot undo and must now stand inside the consequences of it. Loretta Whitfield was arriving today. He had written those letters in June. June felt like a season from another life. He had written them when he still had 40 head of cattle and a working forge area near the barn, and a thread of optimism that he had since lost so completely. He could no longer remember what it had felt like to hold it. He had written about the ranch in terms that were not lies exactly, but were the truth of what the place had been, rather than what it had become. Green pastures along the creek, a sturdy house, plans for the future. The language of a man who still believed the future was a place he could build toward. He had not mentioned the debt. He had told himself it was because he expected to resolve it before she arrived. He had spent the summer and autumn working toward that resolution. with everything he had, taking hauling jobs from neighboring ranches. When his own work allowed selling equipment, he had hoped to keep trimming the household down to its bare minimum, until the only furniture in the main room was what was necessary for sitting and eating and nothing more. He had worked from before sunrise to after dark, and the numbers had simply refused to cooperate. The drought that had killed half his herd had not broken. The disease that took more of what remained had not spared him the way he had prayed it might. By September, he had known the truth. The resolution was not coming. The $800 was not going to appear before Christmas, regardless of how hard he worked alone on this piece of land. And still he had not written again. Pride had kept him silent. The same pride that had kept him from asking any neighbor in Silver Creek for help over 3 years of slow disaster. The pride of a man who had inherited a father's dream and was watching it die, and could not bring himself to ask anyone to witness the dying, let alone assist with it. Now it was the 11th of December. Loretta Whitfield had been traveling for 8 days from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Gideon Marsh was standing at a leaning fence post in the snow, 14 days from foreclosure, waiting for a woman he had deceived through omission, and hoping in some part of himself he could not quite reach that something in the next 2 weeks would be different from everything in the last 3 years. He watched the stagecoach crest the hill above the town. His hands were trembling, not from the cold. She was the third person off the coach. Gideon had positioned himself near the station without making it obvious he was positioned there. He stood at a slight distance from the small knot of men waiting for the Durango route, close enough to see clearly, far enough to feel less visible than he was. He told himself this was practical. There was no useful reason to examine the self-deception more closely. The first passenger down was a merchant he recognized from the dry goods supply in Durango, a heavy-set man in a brown coat who moved with the brisk confidence of someone who knew where he was going. The second was a young man with a cattle agent's leather satchel and the look of someone who had never been to Silver Creek before and was reassessing his choices in light of what he was seeing. Then Loretta Whitfield. She came down the stage steps without hesitation, one hand on the rail for the descent, and then she simply stood on the frozen ground of Silver Creek and looked at the town. Not with the overwhelmed expression of someone encountering the territories for the first time. Not with the careful hopefulness of someone trying to find the beauty in a difficult place. She looked at it with the particular quality of attention of a person who is reading something, assessing what is below the surface of what they are seeing. She was not young. He had known that from her letters. She had told him plainly that she was 63, that she had been widowed 4 years before, a quieter loss than that, but a real one, she had said, and that she had no children and no family remaining in Philadelphia worth the name. He had written back with equal plainness about his own age and circumstances, the edited version of those circumstances, and they had corresponded for 4 months before he had asked, and she had agreed, and the arrangements had been made. She was a woman with white hair and a straight back, and the kind of face that had been through enough weather that its expressions were economical. She did not waste expressions. Gideon could see that from 40 feet away. Her carpet bag sat at her feet, and he could tell from the way it had landed that it was heavy, heavier than he had expected. The weight pulled the bottom of the bag against the frozen ground at a dense, settled angle. He separated himself from the small group of waiting men and walked toward her. She saw him coming before he reached her. Her eyes moved to him the way her eyes had moved over the town, assessing, registering, not showing the conclusion before she had finished reaching it. Miss Whitfield. His voice came out rougher than he had intended. He did not use his voice as much as he once had. Mr. Marsh. She extended her hand. He took it. Her grip was not the polite half-grip of a woman performing the formality of a handshake. It was a full clasp, fingers wrapping to the back of his hand firm and direct. Her palm was calloused in a way he did not register fully until after he had released it and was trying to understand what he had felt. The wagon ride from the station to the ranch passed in the way that silences pass between two people who have communicated at length in writing and are now discovering what correspondence cannot convey. The gap between letters and presence. She sat on the bench beside him and looked at the landscape with that same reading quality, her eyes moving methodically over the valley. The creek line, the distant shapes of neighboring properties. Good water, she said. He glanced at her. The creek, she said. You can see where it cuts through from here. The land below the creek line has different character from the land above it. Greener bones underneath even in winter. He had not thought of the land in those terms. The bones of a place. The bones of the ranch itself told a different story than the land did. He watched her see it as they approached. The barn that sagged along one wall where the structural post had shifted in the spring thaw 2 years ago, and he had not had the material to repair it properly. The fences along the upper pasture that leaned and listed at intervals the wire slack between posts that had heaved with the frost cycles, until their plumb was just a memory. The cattle she could see from the road standing in a rough cluster near the hay feeder, their winter coats unable to hide the sharpness of their ribs. His jaw was tight enough to ache. The house itself was sound. That much he had maintained. The roof held. The foundation held. The stove worked. He had kept the floors clean and the kitchen in order with the kind of deliberate attention a man pays to the last thing he can control when everything else is sliding past his ability to manage. There were no curtains because he had sold them along with the better furniture in November. There was minimal decoration and minimal everything. It was a house that had been stripped to its essentials and was living on them. She stepped inside without comment. She set her carpet bag down just inside the door. She did not move to look at the rooms or to set her things somewhere, or to perform any of the gestures a newly arrived person performs when they are trying to orient themselves in an unfamiliar space. She stood in the middle of the main room and she looked at him. He should have written, he said. Should have told you things had changed. You came a long way for a fair picture, and I gave you a different one. He paused. You're free to take the next stage back to Durango. I'll pay your fare. She did not answer immediately. The silence lasted long enough that he thought she was deciding which stage would work, whether she needed to rest first. He was already calculating what he had in the drawer by the stove, whether there was enough for the fare without touching the 200. He had saved toward the debt. Then she reached down and unbuckled the carpet bag. She did not speak while she worked the buckle. She drew the bag open and reached inside with both hands and began to remove things. She placed them on the table between them with a methodical precision that had the quality of a ritual performed so many times it had become an unconscious. A hammer first, not a small household hammer for driving picture nails. A blacksmith's hammer, the handle worn smooth from years of use, the head darkened with the particular patina of metal that has been near fire many times. Then tongs. Iron long-handled, the gripping ends shaped for holding hot metal at working distance from a forge. A rasp. A pritchel punch. A hoof pick. A small pritchel block for backing nailwork. A curved knife for trimming. A clincher. Tools that Gideon could not name individually, but which he recognized collectively as the set of a working farrier, the tools for the shaping and fitting of horseshoes. She laid them on his table one at a time. When they were all arranged, she straightened. She looked at him across the tools. Her face held the same economic expression it had held since she stepped off the stage, giving away nothing before she was ready to give it. "The question is," she said, "whether you can work alongside a woman at the forge." The room was quiet. The wind moved against the kitchen window with its thin crack, and the cold came through it the way it always did, a narrow thread of December air that he had learned to ignore. Gideon looked at the tools. He looked at the hands that had arranged them on his table, the hands he had shaken at the station. He understood now what he had felt when her palm met his. The calluses were not in the places where a woman developed them from housework or needlework or any of the labor that hands were typically expected to do. They were the calluses of someone who had gripped a hammer handle for years. The thick pad at the base of the fingers, the roughness along the heel of the palm from repeated vibration, the small scars that came from working metal near heat with hands that got close. "You're a blacksmith," he said. Her expression shifted just enough to indicate that this was a more accurate statement than his tone made it sound. "My father was Ezra Whitfield," she said, "of Philadelphia. He ran the Whitfield Forge for 30 years before he died." She paused for the length of a single breath. "I worked beside him from the time I was old enough to grip a handle safely. He had no sons. He taught me instead." She moved one of the tongs slightly on the table, not from any practical need, a small adjustment. "When he fell ill 2 years before his death, I ran the forge. When he died," she said, "I lost the forge." His second wife's family made clear that a woman operating a blacksmith shop was an embarrassment to the Whitfield name. Her voice carried no particular emotion on this. It was the tone of a person reporting something that had already been fully felt and fully processed. The lawyers agreed with them. Gideon looked at the tools again. 30 years of her father's work, and her own. A business that had been taken from her by people who had decided her skill was a problem, rather than an asset. "I answered your letter," she said, "because you described a working ranch. A place that needed someone with practical abilities." She looked at him steadily. "You described it somewhat more favorably than the situation appears to warrant, but the fundamental description was accurate. This place needs work. Work I can do." She waited. He should have written. He had failed to write. He had brought her 3 days by rail and 2 days by stage to a dying ranch and a problem that had no solution he could currently see. And she was standing in his kitchen with her father's tools on his table, looking at him with the patience of someone who had already done the calculation and arrived at a number she was willing to live with. That evening he opened the ledger. He had been dreading this part more than any other part of the day, more than her arrival, more than her seeing the ranch for what it was. The ledger was the complete and irrefutable record of 3 years of his best effort not being enough. It was written in his own hand, every entry, every number, the drought year columns and the disease year columns, and the columns of what had been sold and what had been borrowed against, and where all of it had ended up. $800, due Christmas Day. 200 saved. 600 short. He laid the book open on the table between them. His hands were not steady. She read it the way she had read the land from the wagon seat, with the systematic attention of someone who was looking for structure, for patterns, for what the numbers were actually saying, rather than what they appeared to say on their surface. She turned pages. She went back to earlier entries. She did not make sounds of sympathy or dismay. She did not look up at him with an expression calibrated to make him feel less like a failure. She read, 3 years of losses, he said, when she reached the most recent columns. Drought cut the herd in half the first year. Disease took more of the second. This year I've worked every hour I had, and it's still not enough. He heard the rawness in his own voice and did not try to smooth it. It's never been enough. She closed the ledger. She was quiet for a moment, not the silence of someone who had nothing to say. The silence of someone who was deciding what the right first thing to say was. Then she stood. "Show me your horses," she said. It was not what he had expected her to say. He had expected the conversation to continue, the one about the numbers and the deadline, and whether there was any path between where they were and where they needed to be by December 25th. He had been preparing himself for that conversation since she stepped off the stage. She was already moving toward the door. He took her to the horses in the last of the fading December light. 4 animals. 2 working horses and the bay mare he used for lighter work, and a roan gelding that had been favoring his right front for 2 weeks in a way that Gideon had not been able to diagnose and could not afford to have looked at by the farrier in town. She went to each horse in turn without being directed to them. She ran her hands along their legs, the way someone runs their hands along the frame of a house they are considering purchasing, pressing at intervals, feeling for what was not visible. When she reached the bay mare, she slowed. She crouched down without ceremony and lifted the mare's left front hoof. She held it and looked. She set it down and lifted the right. She looked at both, and then she looked at the way the mare was standing, the slight distribution of weight away from the left front that even Gideon had not consciously noticed until she made him see it. "She's been favoring this side for a while," Loretta said. "See how the shoe is wearing on the inside edge? That's been pulling the whole leg wrong." She straightened. "The shoe needs to come off and be reset with a different angle. The way it's been sitting, the stress goes up into the fetlock and from there up the leg. If it stays like this through a hard winter of work, she could go lame permanently." Gideon looked at the mare. He had been looking at that horse every day for 2 weeks and had not seen what this woman had seen in 3 minutes. She looked at the roan next, examined both front hooves closely in the fading light. When she stood, her expression had shifted to something more settled, as though the examination had answered a question she had been carrying since she arrived. "Stone bruise," she said. "Poorly fitted shoe probably from the last time he was shod. Someone got the angle wrong. Add wet bedding and he's been developing the early signs of thrush." She glanced at Gideon. None of this is unfixable, but it needed to be caught before it got worse. He stood in the last light of December, with his 2 unsound horses and his leaning fence posts, and his empty pastures and the letter still folded against his chest. And he thought about the 6 months of letters he had exchanged with this woman, the careful descriptions of a ranch he was trying to hold together, and the tools she had placed on his table, and the way she had looked at his horses in the failing light, as if she was looking at something she already understood the language of. He thought about what it meant that she had come, not what it meant to him. What it meant that she had made this choice, a woman who had run a forge in Philadelphia, who had worked beside her father for decades, who had lost the business she had built when the people around her decided that her skills were inconvenient. She had answered his letters not because he was the best option available to her. She had answered them because the frontier offered something that cities did not. A place where the question of whether a woman could do a thing was answered by whether the thing needed doing. "Your forge area near the barn," she said. "The one you mentioned in your 3rd letter. Can I see it?" He took her there with a lantern. The forge area was rough. He had maintained it because certain repairs on the ranch required a working forge, and he had learned the basics over years of necessity enough to set a nail or straighten a bent hinge or accomplish the small repairs that a working ranch required. But it was not a proper setup. The bellows were adequate. The coal supply was adequate. The anvil was solid. A good anvil, actually. Something his father had brought west, and which had survived every difficulty better than most things on the property. She ran her hands over the anvil in the lantern light. She tested the bellows with 3 slow pumps and listened to the sound they made. She examined the coal and crouched to look at the hearth configuration. She did not speak while she worked through this assessment. Then she stood. "This will do," she said. "It's rough, but the bones are sound." There it was again. Bones. He looked at the forge setup he had never fully appreciated and tried to see what she was seeing in it. Inside the house at the kitchen table with coffee that was yesterday's bread and hot water, more than anything that could reasonably be called coffee, they talked. Careful talk. 2 people who had written to each other for 4 months and were now recalibrating what they knew. She told him about her father's shop in more detail than the letters had carried. Ezra Whitfield had started the forge when Loretta was 6 years old, working out of a rented space in a neighborhood where the rail yards and the manufactories brought steady business. By the time she was old enough to work alongside him, he had established a reputation that brought orders from businesses in 3 states. She had learned to read iron, she said, the way some people learn to read books. Iron told you things if you understood the language. Temperature communicated through color, through the way the metal moved under the hammer, through the sound it made when struck. A smith who was working in harmony with the metal worked differently from a smith who was fighting it. Her father had been the first kind, and he had taught her to be the same. When he fell ill, she had kept the books and managed the orders and supervised the 2 apprentices who did the physical work she could not always do while also managing the household and her father's care. When she could, she worked the forge herself. When he died, she had believed for a brief time that there was a path to keeping the business. She had the knowledge. She had the relationships with the suppliers and the customers. She had the tools. She had not had the family's agreement. Her father's second wife married in the year before his illness. And never a comfortable presence in the household had a brother who was a solicitor, and a clear sense of what a respectable family business looked like when the proprietor died. It did not look like a widow woman in a leather apron. The legal process had been efficient, and the outcome had been complete. "I could have found work in the city," she said, "hiding what I was. A woman with a knowledge of metalwork can find positions if she's willing to frame them the right way. To call it household management or industrial oversight, or something that sounds like it belongs in a woman's sphere." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "I was tired of hiding it." Gideon told her about his father in return, about inheriting this land 3 years after his father's death, from a man who had worked it for 30 years and left it in good shape, about the drought that had begun in the 2nd year of his ownership, that slow and grinding kind of drought that didn't announce itself with dramatic heat, but simply withheld rain until the grass thinned and the hay failed, and the creek ran low, and the cattle began losing condition faster than he could restore it. About the disease that came in the drought's wake, because drought-stressed animals were easy targets, about selling everything he could sell and working every job he could find, and watching the numbers refuse to add up regardless. "I wrote to you because I was desperate," he said. "I needed help, and I couldn't ask anyone local." He looked at the table. A mail order arrangement felt like something I could frame differently than asking for charity. Something with some dignity to it. She looked at him across the table. "And now," he said, "now I've got nothing to offer you but honest work and likely failure." She was quiet for a moment. The kitchen was quiet except for the creak of the house in the wind and the thin sound from that window pane crack. Then she pushed back her chair and stood. "Show me your horses," she had said earlier. Now she said something different. "What we have is 14 days," she said. "What I have is skill. What you have is a forge that will work and land that has water, and an understanding that what I can do has value." She looked at him levelly. "I have been told my whole life to be smaller than I am, to fit what I know into the shape of what people expected me to be." She picked up the hammer from the table where she had left it. "I am 63 years old, Mr. Marsh. I am done fitting." He looked at this woman who had traveled 8 days from Philadelphia to a failing ranch in a Colorado December, and had placed her father's tools on his table, and looked at his horses in failing light, and was now standing in his kitchen holding a blacksmith's hammer, as if it was simply the most natural thing in the world. She extended her other hand across the table, not a greeting this time. The other hand, the one without the hammer, an open palm offered straight. He looked at it, calloused and scarred and absolutely certain. He reached across the table and took it. Her grip was strong and steady, and did not flinch. 14 days until Christmas," she said. "We have work to do." Outside the window of the kitchen, with its thin crack letting in the cold, the snow had stopped. The valley was white and still under a sky that had cleared to stars. The cattle in the pasture stood in their winter coats, breathing white steam into the dark air. The fence post at the property line leaned at its defeated angle. The barn sagged along its south wall. But in the kitchen of the Marsh Ranch, 2 people with calloused hands sat across from each other with a ledger on the table and 14 days on the calendar, and a set of blacksmith's tools arranged between them, like the vocabulary of a language they were just beginning to discover they shared. The forge would need to be lit early tomorrow. There was no time to waste, and Loretta Whitfield had not come this far to waste any of it. The forge took a full hour to come alive. Loretta had been up before the light, which was not unusual for her. She had been waking before light since the years when her father's shop opened. Before the rest of the neighborhood was stirring, when the Philadelphia streets still held the particular hush of early morning. And the first thing you heard when you stepped outside was the sound of your own boots on the frozen cobblestones. On this ranch, the darkness before dawn was a different quality, entirely deeper, and more complete without the distant sounds of a city keeping its own hours. But the habit was the same. Before light, before coffee, at the forge. She assessed the setup in the cold gray of first morning the way she had assessed every forge she had ever worked with. The systematic attention of someone who understood that the environment of the work determined the quality of the work before any skill was applied. The bellows she had tested the night before. They were adequate, the leather cracked at one seam, but functional, the draw sufficient to bring a coal fire to working temperature with reasonable effort. The coal supply was adequate for the near term, enough for 2 weeks of steady work if she was not wasteful with it. The anvil was the best thing in the setup, a 150-pound London pattern with a face still reasonably flat and a horn in good condition. The kind of anvil that had been bought by someone who understood what they were buying. She worked the bellows until the coals caught, and then she worked them more until the fire was what she needed it to be. The cold of the December morning pushed against the open side of the forge area, but the fire pushed back, and within 30 minutes the working space had reached the temperature where she could begin. She started with the horses, the bay mare first. She pulled the existing shoe from the left front hoof with her pull-offs, working carefully along the clinches, and held it in the fire until it told her what she needed to know about its composition and its faults. The shoe had been set wrong from the beginning, the angle off by just enough to put uneven load on the outside of the hoof wall over time. It was the kind of error a distracted smith made, or a rushed one, or one who had not looked carefully enough at the way this particular horse carried her weight. Before deciding what she needed, she set it aside and began shaping a replacement. The iron came to orange in the fire, and she brought it to the anvil. The hammer in her hand was the same hammer her father had put in her hands when she was old enough to hold it safely. The one she had taken from his shop, along with the rest of the tools before the solicitors arrived with their paperwork. It had a slightly longer handle than the standard smith's hammer, a modification her father had made to suit his reach, and that suited hers as well. She had used it so many years that the rhythm of it was as natural as breathing. Strike turn read the metal strike again. The iron bent to the shape she intended because she was not fighting it. She was asking it. Gideon came out of the house an hour after sunrise. He stopped at the edge of the forge area and watched. She did not look up from the work, but she was aware of him in the peripheral way that a person who works in a shared space becomes aware of another presence, the weight of attention felt even when it is not seen. She finished the sequence she was in, brought the shoe to the water bucket and quenched it, tested the set in her hand. She brought it to the mare. The fitting took patience. A hoof is not a static object, and a shoe must account for the particulars of how a specific horse loads a specific foot. She trimmed with the rasp, checked the fit. Trimmed again, checked again. Gideon was still watching. She could feel him recalibrating something in the way people recalibrated when they encountered competence in a place they had not expected it. When the shoe was set, and the nails clinched, and the excess nail ends filed smooth, she stood and led the mare in a small circle. The horse moved without the slight hesitation that had been present before. The loading was even. The rhythm was correct. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She's walking sound." "She is," Loretta said. She set down the rasp. "The roan will take longer because there's some condition in his hoof wall that needs treating before we shoe him again. But if you pack the bruised area correctly and keep his bedding dry, he should be sound within the week." He nodded slowly. He was doing the recalibrating again. She let him do it. On the third morning, Tom Hadley rode up the road to the ranch leading a limping gelding. He was a rancher from the valley's eastern side, a broad man in his 40s with the direct manner of someone who had been dealing with livestock emergencies long enough to dispense with social preliminaries. He had heard, he said, that Marsh had a blacksmith working. His own smith was laid up with a broken arm and had been for 2 weeks, and this horse needed attention he could not provide himself. Loretta looked at the horse before she looked at Hadley. "Stone bruise on the right front," she said after a minute. "Poorly fitted shoe creating lateral pressure and early signs of white line separation at the toe." She straightened and looked at him. "I can address all of it. $12. Hadley's eyebrows went up briefly. Then he said, "I've paid more for worse work." He tied the horse to the post. 2 hours later, the gelding walked sound out of the yard. Hadley counted $12 silver into Loretta's palm and looked at the horse and then at her with an expression that had shifted somewhere between arrival and departure into something approaching respect. "I'll send others," he said, "and I'll be back myself." Gideon stood at the barn door watching Hadley ride away. Loretta came to stand beside him. She opened her hand and showed him the coins. He looked at them for a long moment. $12, he said, "in one afternoon." She pocketed the money. "We need 588 more, she said. "But it's a start." The days built their own structure after that. Gideon took the ranch work, the feeding and the maintenance and the hauling jobs he had arranged with neighboring operations, the work that kept the land and the animals from failing further, while the larger problem remained unsolved. Loretta ran the forge. She opened it in the darkness before dawn, and she worked it until the light was gone, and the sound of the hammer on the anvil rang out across the valley of Silver Creek. in a rhythm that people noticed because they noticed any change in the soundscape of a small place. Each evening, they sat at the kitchen table with the ledger. $15 from a batch of tool repairs on the 12th. $9 from an emergency reshoeing on the 13th. When a freight outfit lost a shoe on the road above town, and the driver had heard the same thing Hadley had heard. $22 from a set of custom gate hinges for the Miller Ranch to the north. A job that took the better part of a day because the hinges needed to be fabricated to a specific size that no catalog could supply. The money accumulated the way water accumulated in a drought. Years slowly, never fast enough, but with a persistence that was its own form of hope. On the 5th day of this rhythm, something changed in how the orders arrived. An older man rode out to the ranch in the late morning, a retired freighter named Ambrose who had settled in Silver Creek after 30 years on the mountain routes. He brought a broken axle brace that needed rebuilding and a piece of wagon hardware that needed fabrication from scratch. Standard work, the kind that was unglamorous but necessary. Loretta took the commission and began examining the pieces. Ambrose watched her for a moment. Then he said, "You're from Philadelphia." She looked up. "I am." He said, "I worked the eastern routes for 12 years before I came west. Supplied out of Philadelphia mostly." He paused. "Your father was Ezra Whitfield." She set down the axle brace. The old man was looking at the inside of the axle brace housing where a small mark had been stamped into the metal during fabrication. A small mark that her father had begun using 20 years ago to identify his shop's work, a stylized W with a bar beneath it. She had kept using it after he died because it was the mark of the work's quality, and she had maintained that quality, and it belonged on everything she made. Ambrose said, "I bought hardware from your father's shop for 8 years. Best iron work I ever used." He looked at her. "You're the one who ran the shop those last 2 years when he was ill." She did not answer immediately. He said, "I heard the family sold the business. I always thought that was a shame." He picked up his hat from the post beside him. "The work is the same. I'd know that mark anywhere." He rode out an hour later, and by the following morning 3 new customers had arrived at the ranch. Not by coincidence. In the way that information traveled in small places through the specific transmission of one person telling another the precise thing they needed to know. Ambrose had talked to someone who had talked to someone else. The daughter of Ezra Whitfield was working a forge outside Silver Creek. The mark on the work was the same mark that had been on the hardware and tools and custom fittings they had been buying from Philadelphia catalogs for years. The orders increased. A ranch to the southeast sent a man with a list of winter repairs that had been accumulating since October, when their regular smith had moved on. A merchant from the town sent word that he needed custom display hardware for a new shop front and would pay premium for quality. A woman who kept horses for a small livery operation on the edge of Silver Creek sent all 4 of her animals out on consecutive days for assessment and shoeing. Each evening, the numbers in the ledger grew. Still not fast enough, but the rate was changing. On the 8th day, Harlan Dowd rode out to the ranch. He did not arrive the way Hadley had arrived, with a limping horse and a practical need, and the direct manner of someone who wanted a problem solved. Dowd rode out on a horse worth more than most of the cattle in the valley, wearing a coat that had been made for him rather than bought off a shelf, and he arrived in the middle of the morning when the forge was burning, and Loretta was in the middle of a commission. He positioned himself near enough to observe, without positioning himself close enough to be part of what was happening. He watched for several minutes. He was 52 years old and had the particular quality of a man who had made his money through attention to other people's difficulties. He owned property in Silver Creek and in 3 other settlements within 50 miles. and he had a way of appearing at the edge of situations that were approaching crisis with a patience that never seemed hurried, because the math of those situations was almost always working in his favor, and he knew it. "Impressive," he said finally to no one in particular. His eyes were on Loretta. Then he looked at Gideon, who had come out of the barn when he heard the horse. "Heard you've got quite the setup here now, Marsh." He smiled in the way of a man performing friendliness. "Your Smith produces quality goods. Your Smith. Not her name, not her title. The possessive construction of a man describing a tool." He said, "If circumstances change before the 25th, my offer still stands." He said it as though he were doing Gideon a favor by remembering him. Then he turned his horse and rode back toward town. Gideon stood watching him go. Loretta set down the piece she had been working. She looked at his face. He said, "Dowd has wanted this land for 2 years. He's been waiting for the bank to take it." She looked at the road where Dowd's horse was diminishing into the distance. She picked up her hammer again. "Then let's not give him the satisfaction," she said. On the 9th day, Gideon stopped bringing wood to the forge and started staying. It began practically enough. She needed a second pair of hands for a gate hinge commission that required holding a long piece while she worked the end of it. The kind of job that required the metal to be held at a specific angle throughout the sequence, or the work would be off. He held it. She worked. The commission was finished in half the time it would have taken her alone. He stayed after that. She found him watching her work the way people watched work. They were trying to understand, rather than work they were evaluating, not with the skeptical attention of someone waiting for a mistake. With the quiet focus of someone learning a language and trying to find the pattern in it. She let him watch. And then she started explaining. "The iron tells you when it is ready," she said. "See the color? That orange-yellow. That is the working window." She brought the piece to the anvil. "Too soon and the metal is still fighting you. Too late and it fights you differently, goes brittle." She struck twice and the metal moved the way she intended it to. When it is right, it cooperates. She looked at him. "You are thinking too much about the hammer. The hammer is just the messenger. You are trying to tell the metal something. The hammer carries the message." He tried it. His first attempts had the quality of all first attempts, by a person who has been watching skill and is now discovering the gap between observing and doing. But he listened when she corrected him, and he adjusted, and he tried again. His hands were not unskilled hands. They were hands that had been doing physical work for 30 years, and they understood the relationship between effort and result, the way a tool worked with you or against you, depending on how you held it. By late afternoon of the 9th day, he could work the bellows in coordination with her rhythm, without being told when to pump and when to hold. He could identify the working temperature by color, with about 70% accuracy. He could hold pieces at the angle she specified without drifting. It was not mastery. It was the beginning of understanding. That evening at the kitchen table, she updated the ledger while he made the coffee, which had improved over the course of the week as he figured out the proportions she actually preferred. She did the math. He set the cups down and looked at the numbers over her shoulder. $340 total, she said. Combined with your original $200, $540. We need $800. She paused. December 20th. 5 days remaining. 260 short. He sat down. The 5 days lay between them on the table like a physical thing, a narrow bridge with the gap still visible below it. She heard him start to say something and then stop. She looked up. He was looking at the tools on the shelf where she had moved them after that first night, arranged with the same systematic logic she arranged everything. He was looking at the hammer. She waited. "This isn't what you signed on for," he said finally. His voice had the roughness she had noticed on the first day. The roughness of a man who did not use his voice for emotional things and found it unreliable when he tried. Saving a stranger's ranch, working yourself into the ground for someone else's debt. She set down the pencil. She looked at him across the table in the lamplight of the kitchen, with its thin crack in the window and its sparse furniture, and its quality of a place that had given away everything that wasn't essential and was living on what remained. She said, "You think I came here for comfort?" He met her eyes. "In Pennsylvania," she said, "I was told my skills were something to be managed, something to hide or reframe or apologize for." She kept her voice even. "I had 12 years in my father's shop before the city decided I was doing something improper, by knowing what I knew. I had 2 more years running that shop while my father was dying, and I kept it running well. When he died, the lawyers told me the business would be better managed by people who could manage it correctly." She looked at the hammer on the shelf. They meant men. The fire in the stove shifted and settled. She said, "Your letters described a place where a person with practical skills could use those skills without being told the skills were the problem." She looked back at him. "You described it more generously than the current situation warrants. But that description was not entirely false. You have not once in 9 days suggested that I should let you handle the man's work. You have not once looked at what I do and decided it was something that needed managing." He was quiet. "You work alongside me," she said, "because it gets the work done. That is more honest than most arrangements people make." He said, "I'm not threatened by what you can do. I'm grateful for it." She said, "Do you understand how rare that is?" He looked at the ledger with its numbers that were still inadequate, and the 5 remaining days that were still insufficient. He looked at this woman who had come 8 days by rail and stage to sit across from him in a stripped-down kitchen and tell him the truth about things without decoration or apology. "Probably not," he said. The next morning began with what she recognized immediately. She was in the middle of a horseshoe commission when the first man arrived to ask for his money back. He was a farmer from the northern end of the valley, a man she had not met before, who arrived with the particular tightness of a person who has been told something that made him angry and is trying to manage the anger in public. He said he had heard the shoes she set on his neighbor's mare had been coming loose. He had paid her $4 for 2 horses 3 days ago, and he wanted the $4 back. She asked him to bring the horses. He brought them the following hour. She examined both horses in front of him, checking each hoof, each shoe, each clinch. She found nothing loose. She found the work exactly as she had left it, sound and correctly set. She showed him what she was looking at. She explained the quality of the clinch work and why it would hold. She asked him to watch both horses walk and to identify any sign of unsoundness. He could not. He left without asking for the money back and without apologizing for having come. But he did not spread further doubt, which was the point of the exercise. The second person arrived that same afternoon, and the third the following day. None of them had actual problems with the work. All of them had heard the same kind of formless concern, the kind that did not come from experience, but from suggestion. She worked through it the same way each time. "Come, look, show me the problem." There was never a problem to show. Gideon found her at the forge late on the 10th evening after the third person had come and gone. He stood at the edge of the firelight, and she finished the piece she was working before she looked up. He said, "This is coming from somewhere." She said, "I know." He said Dowd was in town today. He was at the general store when Hadley's son was there. Hadley's son heard him talking about the horses his father had shot here. She set down the hammer. She looked at the fire for a moment. "He cannot break the work," she said, "because the work is sound. So he is trying to break the reputation instead." She picked up the tongs. "The best answer to that is more work. Better work. Work that speaks so clearly that the rumors have no room to stand beside it." She went back to the forge. On the 11th day, Dowd came back. This time, he came with the Territorial Bank's representative, a man named Graves, who wore the particular expression of someone performing a professional function and was not personally invested in its outcome. They sat at Gideon's table, and Dowd presented his offer with the careful language of a man who had been preparing it. $400, he said, for the ranch and its water rights, today. The bank will dismiss the remaining debt against the payment. He spread papers on the table. You would leave with enough to start somewhere smaller, somewhere manageable for one man. He paused. "You are not going to raise $800 in 4 days, Marsh. Not in December in Silver Creek. What I am offering you is a dignified exit." The banker cleared his throat softly. "Mr. Marsh, Mr. Dowd's offer is, given the circumstances, generous. You would retain something. Most men in your position retain nothing." Gideon looked at the papers. He looked at the foreclosure notice folded in the ledger on the shelf. He looked at the window where the valley was gray and cold beyond the glass. Then he said the debt will be paid, in full, on Christmas Day. Dowd's expression remained patient. He was a man who had heard unlikely declarations before and had learned to wait for the arithmetic to do what arithmetic does. He gathered his papers. He stood. He said, "My offer stands through the 24th. Think carefully." After they were gone, Gideon sat at the table. He sat there for an hour before Loretta came in from the forge. She came in and looked at the table, and then at his face, and understood what had happened without requiring it to be explained. She sat across from him. She opened the ledger. She did the math with the methodical attention she gave everything, and the numbers came out the same way they always came out in December of this particular year. When she finished, she looked up. He said, "Dowd is right. The arithmetic is what it is." She was quiet for a long moment. Not the silence of agreement. Something else. She said, "The Christmas market opens tomorrow. In town." He looked at her. She said, "Premium goods for Christmas buyers. Decorative ironwork. The kind of work people stop to look at." She turned the pencil in her fingers. A door knocker in the shape of a winter bird sells for $25 to the right buyer. A set of decorative fireplace tools for $35. Christmas ornaments, stars and bells and angels, $2 each to the woman who wants to give her family something made by hand rather than ordered from a catalog. She met his eyes. Desperate people with money, she said, always overpay for beauty. Right before Christmas, he looked at her, at the ledger, at the 15 pieces they would need to make in one night to have enough to offer. "It is a gamble," he said. She said, "Everything we have done for 11 days has been a gamble. The difference is I am good at this. I am very good at this, and I know what sells." She stood. She said, "I cannot do it alone. I need you to work the bellows, to hold pieces, to learn what I show you, as fast as you can learn it." She looked at him directly. 15 hours of work between now and when the market opens. 15 pieces that will make people stop walking and look at them the way people stop and look at something they did not expect to find. It was insane. It was the last card in a hand that had been running out of cards for 3 years. It was either the kind of desperation that preceded a turning point or the kind that preceded a final failure. And there was no way to know which until it was over. Gideon stood. He said, "Tell me what to do." She was already at the door. They lit the forge in the darkness of the 11th night, and they kept it burning until the sky began to lighten over the mountains to the east. Loretta worked with the focused intensity of a person who had been given a problem with specific constraints and had decided that the constraints were not the point. She took iron, and she asked it to become other things. A door knocker with a winter bird, whose feathers she rendered with a small chisel, and a patience that seemed improbable given the timeline. A fire poker whose handle resolved into the head of a horse with its eyes half closed, resting. Christmas ornaments that achieved what seemed impossible in iron, the suggestion of delicacy, stars with fine points and bells with a proper taper, and small angels whose wings she worked out of flat plate with a technique that involved many small strikes instead of a few large ones. Gideon worked beside her. He learned as she taught in the compressed and urgent way of learning that happens under necessity, how to hold a piece at the right angle while she worked the other end, when to quench and when to let it cool in air based on what the next step required, how to add small surface details with the smaller hammer using a controlled wrist rather than an arm stroke. His work was not her work, but it was work and it was useful. And it was directed by her hand and her eye, and when she corrected him, he absorbed the correction and applied it. By midnight, they had 6 pieces finished. By 3 in the morning, they had 12. By the time the sky was beginning to consider becoming something other than black, they had 15 pieces laid out on the workbench in the cold air of the forge area. And both of them stood looking at them in the early light that was not quite light yet. And neither of them spoke for a long moment. The iron work was extraordinary. Gideon had no framework for evaluating ironwork with any technical precision, but he knew what something looked like when a person had given it everything they had. He knew what the combination of skill and desperation looked like when it produced something that exceeded what the individual components should have been able to create. He had seen it in ranchers who had no business making it through a bad year, and had made it through anyway by working past the point where effort should have been enough. He was looking at that now in iron and firelight. Loretta's hands were trembling slightly from the hours of sustained effort. She gripped the edge of the workbench to steady them without commenting on it. Her face had the carved quality of someone who had burned through their reserves of energy and was operating on something deeper than reserves. He crossed the space between them without entirely deciding to. She did not step back. He said, "I cannot promise this will work." She said, "I know. I can only promise I will not stop trying." He put his arms around her. She stood in the circle of his arms in the way of someone who had been standing alone for a long time, and found that the adjustment to not standing alone required a moment of physical recalibration. Then she settled. She smelled like coal smoke and honest work, and something underneath those things that was simply her specific and present and real. He said into her hair, "I don't deserve you." She said, "Probably not." He felt her smile against his chest. "But you're stuck with me anyway." Behind them, the forge fire had settled to a deep bed of coals. The 15 pieces waited in the early light. Somewhere above the valley on the mountains, the first trace of color was beginning to form in the east, the particular deep blue that preceded sunrise in the high country. 4 days until Christmas. 3 days until foreclosure. But standing in the cold pre-dawn darkness with this woman who had walked into a Colorado December and refused to let it win, Gideon Marsh felt something he had not felt in 3 years. The arithmetic was still what it was, But the arithmetic was no longer the only thing. The Christmas market filled the main street of Silver Creek. The way all small-town markets filled their spaces with the accumulated presence of people who had been waiting all week for an occasion to be somewhere other than their own four walls. December 22nd, 3 days until Christmas. 3 days until the bank's deadline. Gideon and Loretta set up their display on borrowed sawhorses at the eastern end of the market, where the morning light would come from the right direction, and the foot traffic from the livery end of town would pass them before reaching the other merchants. This positioning was Loretta's. She had looked at the street layout the previous afternoon when she rode into town for coal, and had come home with the sawhorses and the information about where they should stand. She set the pieces out herself, arranging them with the same systematic logic she brought to everything, not clustered together in a way that diluted their individual presence, spaced so that each piece had room to be itself. The winter burr door knocker at the front left, where the light would catch the texture of the feathers first. The horsehead fire poker standing upright in a piece of scrap timber she had fashioned into a base so the handle was visible from a distance. The Christmas ornaments on a piece of wire strung between the upright supports of the sawhorses turning slowly in the December air, catching the light at different angles as they moved. Gideon stood back and looked at it. He had looked at the pieces many times in the forge area in the gray light of early morning when they finished them. He thought he understood what he was looking at. He did not fully understand until he saw them outside in the winter light of the market, in the context of the other displays around them, the bolts of cloth and the preserved foods and the woodware and the catalog goods that made up the rest of what Silver Creek was offering its residents for Christmas. The iron work was something else. It occupied a different category from everything around it, not because it was expensive or because it was decorated, because it had been made by someone who understood the material so completely that the material had been persuaded to do things it should not have been able to do. The feathers on the winter bird were iron. They looked like feathers. The horse's resting eyes were iron. They looked like rest. The Christmas stars had points that were fine and true. The angels had wings that suggested lightness in a material whose entire identity was weight. People slowed when they passed. The first woman stopped completely. She was the wife of the largest ranching operation in the valley, a woman named Aldous, who was known in Silver Creek for her particular and exacting sense of what constituted quality. She reached out and took the winter bird door knocker with both hands and turned it. She ran her thumb along the line where the wing met the body. She looked at the underside of the base, where the mounting holes had been drilled clean and true. How much, she asked. $25, Loretta said. The woman set it back down on the sawhorse. Then she picked it up again. She said, "I will take it." She looked at the fireplace tools. "Do you have the full set?" Loretta said she did. The woman bought it. $35 for the poker and tongs and brush, and Gideon watched the transaction with the particular quality of attention of a man who is watching a number change from abstract to real. More people came. By mid-morning, the display had drawn enough consistent attention that people were stopping because other people were stopping, which was the arithmetic of public interest. A merchant in a good coat spent a long time looking at the ornaments, and then bought 12 of them at $2 each for his wife's family gathering, he said. A young woman stood for several minutes looking at a small decorative bracket that Loretta had made almost as an afterthought, a piece for mounting a lamp or a small mirror with a fine scrollwork pattern along its face. She counted coins from a small purse and bought it. Gideon could not stay still. He moved between the display and the edge of the market and back, talking to people who asked about the work, directing questions to Loretta when they required more technical answers than he could supply. He was not selling. He was not sure what he was doing, something between bearing witness and being useful. By noon, they had sold 8 pieces, $195. He stood beside Loretta in a gap between customers and did the calculation in his head, and then did it again to make sure. "We need 405 more, he said quietly. "I know," she said. She was watching a family examining the remaining pieces. "Keep talking to people. Tell them about the custom work we can take orders for. Spring delivery, things people want that aren't in the display." He did. He discovered that he knew how to talk about the work in a way he had not known before the past 11 days, not because he had become a smith, because he had watched one. He had stood next to a woman who understood iron so completely that she could explain what she was doing while she did it. And enough of those explanations had settled into him that he could now tell someone what made a well-set horseshoe different from a poorly set one, what the difference in the gate hinge quality meant for how long it would hold, why the Christmas ornaments had a surface texture that the catalog versions did not. He talked and people listened, and some of them stopped and bought, and some of them took the information somewhere else to spend it later. Harlan Dowd appeared at noon. He came from the direction of the bank, which was on the north side of the market, and he arrived with the ease of a man who was accustomed to being the most significant presence in any space he entered. He was wearing the maid coat and the hat that went with the coat, and he moved through the market with the quality of someone doing a tour of property he already considered his. He stopped at their display. He looked at the pieces that remained with the assessing attention of a man whose primary relationship with objects was their monetary value rather than their qualities. He picked up one of the remaining Christmas ornaments, a small iron bell with a crisp taper, and a surface that had been finished to a smooth darkness, and turned it in his fingers. A small crowd had gathered near the display during the course of the morning and had not entirely dispersed. The market had the quality that good markets have of people moving through, but also lingering, staying near things that interested them. Dowd looked at Gideon. He said loudly enough to carry to the people nearby, "Impressive work, Marsh. Your blacksmith produces quality goods." The words were arranged to do a specific thing. Your blacksmith. Not her name. Not her title as a craftsperson. The possessive construction that placed Loretta in the category of equipment rather than partnership that erased the 11 days of work and the father's 30 years before them, and the 2 years of the shop she had run after him, and reduced the whole of it to an asset belonging to the man beside her. The crowd heard it. That was the point. The crowd hearing it was the entire mechanism of the thing. Gideon felt the words land the way he had been feeling things land more accurately for the past 11 days. He understood in a way he had not understood before Loretta's arrival, the precise nature of what Dowd had just done. He had used language to reassign credit. In a single sentence in front of witnesses, he had described the work as Gideon's by proxy, as something that existed because Gideon had chosen to employ a useful tool, rather than as the work of a 63-year-old woman who had spent her life learning to do it, and had crossed half the country with her father's tools in a carpet bag to have a place where she could do it without apology. The people around them were looking at Gideon. He knew what the easy response was. He had made easy responses to uncomfortable situations his entire adult life. The pride that had kept him silent for 3 years of slow disaster on this ranch was the same pride that would keep him silent now if he let it. The silence of a man who could not quite bring himself to say the true thing when the true thing cost him something. He looked at Loretta. She was standing straight the way she always stood, with the particular quality of stillness that she had when she was waiting for something rather than reacting to it. She was not looking at him with an expression of appeal or of demand. She was not performing patience for the audience. She was simply present the way she was always simply present, doing the thing that was in front of her, which at this moment was waiting to see what kind of man was standing beside her. He thought about her blistered hands. He thought about the hours before dawn at the forge, the 15th piece finished in the cold first light of this morning. He thought about the mare walking sound for the first time in 2 weeks. He thought about $12 in silver on the first afternoon, and the sound of her voice explaining what she was seeing in the horse's hoof, while the horse stood quietly, because she knew how to stand near an animal without making it afraid. He thought about 3 years of pride that had nearly destroyed everything his father built. The pride of a man who could not ask for help. The pride of a man who could not admit that working alone was killing him. He had come so close to losing the thing he most needed to hold that the distance between what had happened and what could have happened was difficult to look at directly. He said clearly and without rushing it, "This is the work of my wife." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The market had the quality that small spaces have where sound carries further than the speaker intends, and the people who were near enough to matter were near enough to hear. He said, "Loretta Marsh, blacksmith." Her father was Ezra Whitfield of Philadelphia, whose work supplied 3 states for 30 years. She learned her trade from him, and she ran his shop after him, and everything you see on this display she made with her own hands. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a public space, absorbing a piece of information that has rearranged something. Mrs. Aldous, who had bought the first piece that morning and was standing nearby talking with another woman, turned to look at Loretta with an expression that had shifted from the consumer's appraising interest she had worn at the beginning of the day to something more direct. She said, "Mrs. Marsh, I have a commission I would like to discuss with you. Custom work for the main house. A gate and matching hardware." She named a figure for the initial conversation that made the number in Gideon's head do something unexpected. A banker's wife who had been looking at the ornaments for several minutes stepped forward and said she would like the remaining 3. Another man from the Northern Valley ranches said he had a season's worth of repair work he had been sending to Denver because he had not trusted the local options. And if the Whitfield name was attached to the work coming out of this operation, he would like to discuss a regular arrangement. Dowd had not moved. Gideon looked at him. Dowd was doing the recalculation that Gideon had watched happen in other people over the past 11 days. The reassessment that occurred when a situation turned out to be different from what it had appeared to be. He was a man who had built his particular kind of success on being able to read the mathematics of a situation accurately before other people did. And the mathematics of this situation had just changed in a way he had not anticipated. He looked at Loretta. He looked at the crowd that had formed and at the pieces that remained, and at the order that Mrs. Aldous was discussing with a ranching wife nearby. He put the iron bell he had been holding back down on the display. Then he said, "Mrs. Marsh, I need a quality blacksmith on permanent retainer for my operations. My current smith is adequate but not exceptional, and my operation has grown past adequate." He named a monthly figure. Year contract. First 2 months paid in advance. He said it the way he said everything, with the manner of a man doing a favor. But he said it to her, not about her, and he said her name correctly, and Gideon understood that Dowd was not doing this from generosity. He was doing it because the crowd had witnessed the conversation and the mathematics of being the man who offered the work to a woman who had just been publicly recognized by her husband as the best smith in the county was better than the mathematics of being the man who had tried to dismiss her. Dowd had made a career of reading mathematics. Loretta looked at Gideon, not to ask permission, to offer him the participation that a decision made jointly required. He nodded once, She turned back to Dowd. She said, "We accept. The contract will be with Marsh Forge and Ranch, both names." She said it without emphasis, as though it were the obvious arrangement and the only reasonable one. Any work order goes through the ranch operation and is billed accordingly. Dowd's expression showed the very brief passage of the calculation he was performing. The contract he had intended to offer as a way of extracting her from Gideon's situation had just become a contract with both of them. He had come to the market with one kind of mathematics in mind and was leaving with a different kind. He said agreed. He said it without pleasure and without displeasure. He said it the way a man accepted the terms of a negotiation he had not entirely controlled. He reached inside his coat for his billfold and counted out $80. First 2 months. He left before the end of the market. By the time the market closed in the late afternoon, they had sold the remaining pieces and taken orders for spring work that Loretta had written in the small notebook she had produced from her coat pocket. They had the $80 from Dowd's contract, the $195 from the morning sales, and another $40 from the afternoon. $315. They stood in the cold evening light of Silver Creek's main street, while the other merchants packed their displays and the townspeople moved toward their homes, and the lamplighter worked his way along the street, bringing the gas lamps up one by one. Gideon did the arithmetic. 315 from today, 540 from before, 855 total. He said the number quietly. She said more than enough. They stood in the street for a moment. The math that had been impossible for 11 days had resolved itself in the course of a single afternoon. Not easily, not simply, but completely. He said it was the work. You were right about what people would pay for it. She said it was also what you said. He looked at her. She said what you told people about the work. Publicly. That mattered. She paused. Not to the money, to the work itself. She looked at the main street of Silver Creek in the evening light. A place is made of what people say about each other in it. He thought about that. He thought about the things that had been said about Loretta since her arrival. The useful, careful things and the other kinds. He thought about what Dowd had said with his possessive construction, and what Gideon had said immediately afterward, and the specific difference between those two sentences, and what they implied about who this woman was in this place. She had arrived 11 days ago as a stranger. She was leaving this market street as someone people knew by name, by skill, by the word of her husband spoken clearly in a public space. That was a different kind of arrival than the one she had made at the stage station. They drove back to the ranch in the dark. The valley was still and cold and clear, the mountains to the west showing their outlines against a sky full of stars. The horses moved at a steady pace on the familiar road, and Gideon let them find their own pace. He held the reins loosely, and beside him Loretta sat with her hands in her lap and watched the dark shapes of the landscape passing. Somewhere above town, from the direction of the church whose bell had been ringing for Sunday services when Loretta arrived 11 days ago, a sound carried through the cold air. Children singing. One of the Christmas preparations that filled the last days before the holiday in small towns. Everywhere the choir practice or the school pageant or the informal carol that happened when enough people with children found themselves in the same space close enough to Christmas. She said I used to sing. Before. She said it without elaboration. And he understood that before meant the years in Philadelphia. The Forge years, the years when there had been a life around the work, and not just the work alone. He said, "What did you sing?" She said whatever was needed. She paused. My father could not carry a tune. He was very good at iron and very bad at music. She said it with the particular quality that her rare humor had, dry and specific, and entirely without sentimentality. He used to say that God had given him one gift and he had used it correctly. Gideon said, "I cannot carry a tune either." She said, "I suspected as much." The ranch came into view as they crested the last rise before the property. The dark shapes of the buildings against the snow. The barn and the house and the forge area. And beyond it, the upper pasture, where the cattle stood in their clusters. The horseshoe above the barn door caught the starlight, in the way it caught light at any angle that old worn shoe that Loretta had nailed in place on the first evening, the one she had called a promise rather than luck. He unharnessed the horses and she held the lantern while he did it, and they worked in the coordination that 11 days had built between them, each knowing where the other was and what was needed without the words. Inside the house, she made coffee while he stoked the stove, and they sat at the kitchen table for the last time, with the ledger open between them. And she wrote the final numbers with the same pencil she had used on every entry since she arrived. $855. The number sat at the bottom of the page with the authority of a calculation that had closed. She closed the ledger. They sat in the lamplight of the kitchen, and the stove ticked, and the window with its thin crack let in its thread of cold air, and it did not seem important the way it had seemed important 11 days ago. Christmas morning was clear and cold, and the sun came over the eastern peaks at the angle that meant the solstice had just passed low and bright, and carrying the particular quality of a Colorado winter morning that had been cold enough all night to make everything sharp at its edges. Gideon dressed in the clothes he wore for town. Loretta wore the dark dress she had been wearing when she stepped off the stagecoach. She had pressed it the previous evening with the iron she had heated on the stove, and it was correct for the occasion in the way she was correct for the occasion, without excess, without performance, in full possession of itself. They drove into Silver Creek. The bank was open on Christmas morning because in this part of the territory, a foreclosure deadline did not observe the holiday, and the banker was a man who understood that his presence was required to accept what was due. He looked up when they came in, and he had the expression of a man who had made a professional calculation about probable outcomes and was now discovering that the calculation had not accounted for one or more variables. Gideon set the money on the desk. He had counted it the previous night into proper order, and he placed it in the careful sequence of a man who had been thinking about this moment for a long time and intended to perform it correctly. $800 in the bills and silver that represented 11 days of work, and 30 years of his father's work before that, and 50 years of Loretta's father's work before that. And whatever measure of future work the ranch now represented, all of it reduced to the specific sum on the specific day, by the specific act of placing it on a banker's desk in Silver Creek, Colorado on Christmas morning, 1889. The banker counted it. He counted it again with the methodical procedure of someone who needed the verification to be complete and documented. Then he opened his drawer and took out the deed and the loan papers, and he stamped the payment received in full across the face of the loan document with the stamp that made this true in the way that institutional things become true through the formal action of the institution that had defined them. He handed the deed to Gideon. Gideon held it. It was a piece of paper. It was the document that had existed in one form or another since his father had staked the original claim, the one that had changed at the bank when the drought and the disease had required borrowing against it. The one that had been the most frightened piece of paper in Gideon's life for the past 14 months. It was an ordinary piece of paper with legal language on it and a property description, and a stamp that said the obligation it had carried was discharged. He held it for a moment. Then he handed it to Loretta. She looked at it with the same reading quality she brought to everything, and she held it for a moment. And then she handed it back. They were standing in the Silver Creek Bank on Christmas morning, and the thing that had seemed mathematically impossible 14 days ago was simply a fact, now complete and documented and real. Outside, she laughed. It was not the polite, contained expression of someone managing their response to a public space. It was a real laugh coming up from somewhere that had been compressed for 11 days and longer, and it changed her face completely. He pulled her to him right there, on the main street of Silver Creek, with the Christmas morning emptiness of the town around them, and he kissed her. She smelled like wood smoke and coal and winter air, and she tasted like the coffee they had made at the ranch before they left. And she kissed him back with the directness she brought to everything she did. "Merry Christmas, partner," she said. "Merry Christmas, wife," he said. They drove home through snow that had started falling sometime after they entered the bank. The soft falling kind that was different from the hard-driven snow of the past weeks. The kind that came without urgency and covered things gently and made the world quieter. The ranch looked the same. That was the thing he kept coming back to on the drive, and then again when they pulled into the yard. The barn still sagged on the south side. The fence posts on the upper pasture still needed replacing. The window in the kitchen still had its thin crack. The cattle were still 18, heads still thin in their winter coats, still the diminished remnant of what the herd had been before 3 years of difficulty had taken the rest. Nothing about the physical place had changed, but the relationship between Gideon Marsh and this piece of land had changed. And that relationship was the thing the land actually was more than any of its physical facts. For 3 years he had been standing on ground that was failing under him, working harder and harder on the wrong side of a simple arithmetic that he could not change by effort alone. Today, the arithmetic had changed, not because the drought had broken, or the debt had been forgiven, or anything had been made easy. Because a woman had stepped off a stagecoach with her father's tools in a carpet bag and had worked beside him until the numbers were what they needed to be. The numbers were what they needed to be. That afternoon, while the snow fell gently on Silver Creek Valley, they worked. Not because there was an emergency, not because a deadline was pressing, because the ranch had things that needed doing, and 2 people with the time and the inclination to do them. And because work was for both of them a way of being present in a place rather than just inhabiting it. Gideon repaired the fence post. It was the specific post he had been looking at since before Loretta arrived, the one that had leaned at its defeated angle since autumn. The one he had understood the feeling of. He dug it out of the frozen ground with a bar and a patience he had not felt equal to before today. And he set it properly with bracing and tamped earth and the kind of attention a man paid to a thing when he believed it was worth doing correctly. Loretta came from the forge with something wrapped in cloth. She unwrapped it. An ornamental iron crown, small and intricate, the kind of thing she had made in the night before the market, but had kept back. It was all spirals and winter stars. The iron worked into curves and points that caught the light from multiple angles. She fitted it to the top of the repaired fence post and stepped back and looked at it. Beauty and strength, she said. Both. He looked at the fence post standing straight with its iron crown in the falling snow and thought about the thing she had said on the first evening when she had nailed the horseshoe above the barn door. Good iron, properly shaped. That was what the ranch needed. That was what she had given it. They spent the rest of the Christmas afternoon doing the small things. The hanging of new hinges Loretta had made for the barn's sagging side. The kind of hinges that were built for the weight they were carrying rather than the decorative hinges that had been there before. The repair of the gate on the upper pasture that had been roped shut for a year because its hardware had failed. The replacement of the kitchen window's thin crack with a piece of glass they had bought in town with the $15 that remained after the bank payment. Small things, the kind that compounded. When the light began to fail and the snow continued its gentle falling and the cattle in the pasture were shapes. In the gathering dusk, they stood together in the barn doorway and looked out at the ranch. The cattle were still thin. The barn still needed its south wall attended to in the spring. The fence lines in the upper pasture still needed the systematic replacement that would take half the summer. The herd would need to be rebuilt from 18 head to something that could sustain the operation, and that would take years of careful management and the kind of working capital they did not yet have. "We will buy more stock in spring," Gideon said, slowly. "Build the herd right, and I will keep the forge running." She looked out at the valley. The custom work, quality over volume, Mrs. Aldis's gate and the spring orders we have, what Dowd's contract brings in monthly. She paused. "It will not make us wealthy. He said it will make us sound." She said yes, that. He thought about the word she had used for the horses when she had fixed them. Sound. The specific quality of a creature that was carrying its weight correctly and moving without the cost of compensating for a fault. The quality of a well-set shoe, a properly fitted hinge, a fence post braced correctly. Sound was not spectacular. Sound was the foundation that made everything else possible. That evening, by lamplight, they exchanged vows. They had talked about it over the previous days, not at length, but in the practical, direct way they talked about everything. No preacher was available in Silver Creek until after New Year, and they had not wanted to wait that long, and they had decided that the vows were the point, not the ceremony around them, and they had each written what they wanted to say. Gideon went first. His voice was rough in the way it was always rough. The roughness of a man who did not use it for certain kinds of speech very often and found it imprecise when he tried. He said, "I promise to work beside you, to value what you know as I value what I know, to not ask you to be smaller than you are because smaller would be more convenient." He paused. "To tell the truth when the truth is what you need, even when the truth costs me something." She looked at him across the lamplight of the kitchen table. She said, "I promise to shape what we are building with the same care I give the iron, to stand beside you when it is difficult." She looked at the tools on the shelf and then back at him. "To make this place a home, not only a ranch, and to never stop asking the metal the right questions." He said, "What does that mean?" She said, "It means I promise to keep looking for what is underneath what appears to be the case, to keep looking for the bones of things." He said the bones. She said yes. They sealed it with a kiss at the kitchen table in the lamplight of the house that was theirs. Later, Gideon hung the new sign Loretta had made in the forge during the night before the market, working it in a moment between other pieces. She had made it the way she made everything, with more care than the time allowed, and more quality than the situation strictly required. Marsh Forge and Ranch, both names, both trades. The letters even and clear in the iron, the surface finished smooth. He hung it at the entrance to the property where the road came onto the land where anyone coming from the valley would see it. He stood back and looked at it. The horseshoe above the barn door had started as a promise. Loretta had said so the first evening when she climbed down from the roof in the last of the sunset light, smelling of coal smoke and honest work, and something entirely herself. She had said, "Good iron properly shaped. That is what this ranch needs. That is what we are going to give it." She had given it. 14 days, $800. 18 cattle who were a foundation rather than a failure now. A forge running and a reputation established. and two people who had come to this arrangement as strangers and had found in the practical space between them something neither of them had known to ask for. The snow had stopped. The valley was quiet and white, and the mountains stood in their dark outlines against the sky that was clearing to stars. The same stars that had been there the night Loretta arrived. The same stars that had been there the night her father's shop was taken from her. The same stars that had been above the Philadelphia forge, where she had learned to read iron before she knew that the knowledge would carry her across half a country to stand in a Colorado yard in the snow on Christmas evening. She came to stand beside him at the sign. He put his arm around her shoulders. She was cold through the layers of her coat, and she was there present and specific and real, the particular warmth of a person who was not an idea or a letter or a practical arrangement, but a woman who had given her best skill and her complete honest self to the hardest 2 weeks of his recent life. "Best Christmas I never thought to ask for," he said. She leaned into him. She said, "Sometimes the best things arrive in the hardest weather." He thought about that. He thought about the December that had come within 14 days of ending everything his father built. He thought about a stagecoach bell echoing across a frozen valley and a woman carrying a carpet bag heavy with iron tools and a stranger's face reading the bones of his land. He thought about 12 silver dollars in an open palm and the first actual working hope in 3 years. He thought about the ranch that was imperfect and scarred and had been stripped to its essentials by difficulty, the house with its patched window and its sparse furniture and its kitchen with the creak and the coffee that had gotten better over 11 days of learning each other's preferences. He thought about the cattle that were 18 and would become more. He thought about the forge that would burn through winter and spring, and the custom work that had its name on it already, and the woman beside him, whose name was on the sign beside his. Inside, the lamplight came through the kitchen window, clean and whole. The crack was gone. In the morning, the work would continue, the real long work. The kind that did not have a deadline but just had the days ahead of it, compounding. The herd to build. The south wall of the barn to address when the weather allowed. The spring orders to complete. The contracts to begin. The 10,000 small decisions of a working ranch and a working forge, and two people learning the language of a shared life. One day at a time, the way you learned any language worth knowing. But that was tomorrow. Tonight the snow was still and the sign was hanging, and the horseshoe above the barn door caught the starlight, and the forge sat cold and patient beside the barn, waiting for morning the way all good tools waited, ready to do exactly what they were built for. Good iron properly shaped. That was what the ranch had needed. That was what they had given it. And standing in the quiet of a Silver Creek Christmas, with the mountains dark to the west, and the valley white and still below Gideon Marsh, understood that the thing he had inherited from his father was not the land, and not the debt, and not the 30 years of effort that had built this place up from bare ground. The thing he had inherited was the belief that the right work done with sufficient honesty would eventually build something that held. He had come closer to losing that belief than he would ever be comfortable remembering. He had not lost it. In the end, that was the only thing that mattered. Not the $800 and not the sign and not the 14 days of impossible arithmetic, finally resolved. The belief. And beside him, carrying her father's tools and her father's mark and the full weight of everything she had learned and refused to hide. Loretta Marsh understood this too, and she said nothing because nothing was required. And they stood together in the snow and the silence and the starlight, and the particular piece of people who have come through something hard and arrived somewhere worth the effort. The forge would burn tomorrow. There was work to do.